Good evening and welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History talk presented with the Ms. Foundation for Women. Tonight is the first of two conversations inspired by Koa Beck's new book, White Feminism. We're joined by a truly extraordinary panel. And in a moment, I will introduce Koa, who will in turn introduce these three amazing women. But first, let me briefly introduce myself and tell you a little bit about the Center for Brooklyn History, BPL Presents, and the Ms. Foundation for Women. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm the Director of Programs at the Center for Brooklyn History, which is a part of the Brooklyn Public Library. In addition to stewarding the most extensive collection of Brooklyn history in the world, the Center for Brooklyn History offers weekly free public programs like this one through Brooklyn Public Library's programming arm, BPL Presents. In the next few weeks, BPL Presents and the Center for Brooklyn History welcome Naomi Klein, historian Russell Shorto, novelist Jennifer Egan, and many, many others. I hope you visit the Brooklyn Public Library's website, you find BPL Presents, and explore what's coming up. We are thrilled to be partners tonight with the Ms. Foundation for Women. Since 1973, the Ms. Foundation has opened up worlds of possibility by championing women and girls and investing over $72 million in more than 1,600 organizations fighting for gender and racial justice nationwide. The Ms. Foundation resources movements that center women and girls of color and creates opportunities for women and girls to seize justice and exercise their power so they are heard, valued, and respected socially and politically. It's absolutely wonderful to join hands with them tonight. I also want to share a few important side notes. First, please check the chat for a link to purchase White Feminism locally in Brooklyn at the community bookstore. Second, I want to invite all of you to share your questions during the program by simply typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And finally, as I mentioned, this is the first of two programs. I hope you'll join us next week for the second, which looks beyond white feminism with Koa Rinku Sen, the former executive director of Race Forward and ED of Narrative Initiative, Teresa Younger, president and CEO of the Ms. Foundation, and Andy Zeisler, co-founder of Bitch Media. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Koa Beck, former editor-in-chief of Jezebel, who was previously executive editor of Vogue.com and the senior features editor at marieclaire.com. In 2019, Koa was awarded the Joan Shorenstein Fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School to study the mechanics, history, and prevalence of white feminism. Her book, White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind, was published last month by Atria. Thank you all so much for being here, so much for being part of this conversation. Koa, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming and prioritizing this conversation. Thank you also to Brooklyn Public Library, the Ms. Foundation, and everyone who assembled the logistics so that we could converse like this. I am beyond excited to introduce our illustrious panel. Barbara Smith is an author and activist who has played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. She was among the first to define an African-American woman's literary tradition and to build Black women's studies and Black feminism in the United States. She Collective in 1975 and of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press in 1981. In 2005, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I also want to add that recently Barbara has written a total of 4 articles about white supremacy, 2 of which have appeared in the Boston Globe and the Nation, respectively. I highly recommend that you read those, especially coming off this discussion.
Thank you so much, Koa.
Thank you for being here, Barbara.
Thank you.
Brittny Cooper is an associate professor of women's and gender studies and Africana studies at Rutgers University. She is co-editor of the Crunk Feminist Collection and the author of Beyond Respectability, The Intellectual Thought of Race Women, and Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. She has been named to the Root.com's Root 100 multiple times, including in 2020. Welcome, Brittny. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Koa.
Roxane Gay is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. She is the author of the books Aidi, An Untamed State, the New York Times bestselling Bad Feminist, and the nationally bestselling Difficult Women, and the New York Times bestselling Hunger. She is also the author of The World of Wakanda for Marvel. She has several books forthcoming and is also at work on television and film projects, which is very exciting. Thank you so much for coming, Roxane.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the discussion and the questions that I've been very excited to ask all of you about labor in this country, and especially what has happened with the pandemic, playing off enduring dynamics, I wanted to, especially for our audience, present my definition of white feminism so that everyone is clear about what I'm talking about when I pose these questions. So I define in my book white feminism as a very specific approach and ideology towards achieving gender equality that pulls very heavily from colonialism, imperialism, some key pieces from white supremacy, and also some facets of capitalism, such as labor exploitation, and deeming it empowering or, quote unquote, feminist for women to engage in these very horrific practices. So I'm going to start there. My first question has to do with a lot of the data that many of us have been confronted with again and again from the top of the pandemic to now. And, as far as my most recent research has indicated, this hasn't really changed. But towards the top of the pandemic, the New York Times published a piece with some data that was then echoed, through a number of other outlets that the essential worker in the United States, as we were grappling with the pandemic, on average was a woman of color. That's who that exact word was referencing when it was used. And also the types of jobs that we were deeming essential labor were filled by women of color. What does that data indicate to each of you about labor in our country? And I'll start with Barbara. Would you like to take that first?
Trying to get off of mute. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody, wherever you are. Women of color have always been super exploited in the United States, starting with a couple of key events. The first was the stealing of the land from the indigenous population and the removal of indigenous people from their land, as well as, of course, genocide. And then there was the system, an unprecedented system of chattel slavery. And the fact that in the early 21st century, in the midst of a pandemic, we realize that women of color are bearing the brunt by taking care of everybody else, and also being poorly, if compensated at all. It's just par for the course. There's historical precedent, and it really does serve the needs of capitalism for that to be the case.
Thank you. Roxane, how do you interpret that?
I'm probably going to say this a lot this evening. I agree with Barbara. I think it's an indication of our past and that we have not learned anything from our past. And that Black women are still taken for granted. You know, we hear a lot of rhetoric, and we've heard this for the past several years, that Black women save the day, and Black women, you know, like we're these sort of angels from on high. But we don't see anything happening politically to reflect that gratitude that supposedly exists. Like even last night, during the town hall, President Biden said he doesn't believe that he can do more than forgive $10,000 in student loans, even though Black women disproportionately bear the burden of student loan debt. And so if you really care about Black women, if you really want to thank Black women, how about you cancel student loan debt in a real number? Executive orders exist for this reason. And when we see the ways in which labor affects Black women and the ways in which we're marginalized, it's a trickle down from this, because we get these degrees to credential ourselves to get a fraction of the opportunities that our white counterparts get. We are paid cents on the dollar for not only white men, but white women, Asian women. And, you know, it just creates this really vicious cycle where Black women can never truly thrive in the workplace, and we're taken for granted, and people continue to try to, you know, say all these nonsense platitudes about Black women. I mean, yes, we're amazing, we know this, but when we're doing things to make the world a better place, we're not doing it for you specifically, we're doing it because we care about other Black women. And it would be great to see labor discourse reflect an understanding of that.
Thank you. Brittany, how do you interpret that data?
So a couple of things. One, I want to echo my colleagues, and it's an honor to be in conversation with both of you, all three of you. One of the things I think about this is, like, every August we have something called Black Women's Equal Pay Day, and it takes till August for Black women to earn what white men earned in the prior year. So it takes every year, it takes us 20 months to earn what white men earn in 12 months. And it takes Latina women even longer. Sometimes they are into September before they have Latina women's equal pay day, right? So I think that simply thinking about that we are doing literally 8 months of labor into the next year before our wages even remotely sort of compare to what white men are bringing home. And when you couple that with things like generational wealth, less stress, the toll that all of this takes, sort of bears a stark difference. So I think that that's part of the story. But if we're talking about this in the context of feminism, and in particular white feminism, or the feminism that many white women practice, one of the things that I think we have to say is that Black women laborers have provided the structural foundation for white women to have their freedom dreams, and that's actually the real story behind the problem of exploiting Black labor. So even in the 1830s, you see a figure like Maria Stewart, who was a very important Black woman figure from Boston, saying, "How long will Black women be buried beneath the load of pots and kettles?" Right? And she's talking about the way that Black women's backbreaking labor of serving white families and of making no money crushes their own ability to imagine life for themselves. When you get to a more mainstream white feminist movement in the late 20th century, where folks like Betty Friedan are talking about white women's ennui and boredom and all of that, they're doing that in a world where Black women are doing the backbreaking labor of sustaining their middle class lives. And so white women are often able to come to consciousness about the ways in which they don't share power with white men, not because they look at Black women's condition and find solidarity with that condition, but rather because Black women are doing the kind of labor that allows white women to have the mental space to think about the places wherein they aren't free. And so that becomes a sustaining condition for most American freedom projects, that Black folks do the kind of backbreaking labor, and then white people get to think about their social condition and ways that things could be better. And so that's what I hear when I hear data of that sort.
Mm-hmm. Brittany, per your observation, I feel like this feeds in, really organically. In my lifetime specifically, I have watched the term "quote unquote" outsourcing be used in a lot of mainstream feminism and certainly white feminist discourse to describe exactly what you're talking about. And I track it in my book in terms of the national conversations that tend to align, with quote unquote feminism, however you're, defining that or thinking about that, but specifically in spaces in which, white collar career success for very specific women has become conflated with feminism in a very, mainstream superficial way. Outsourcing is often, where the conversation tips into labor, but I would argue, and I'm sure you would too, like doesn't, in that the sort of solution to having it all, or any of the weird shorthands that come with that are to hire somebody to do X and hire somebody else to do that and hire somebody to take your mother-in-law to her doctor appointment and hire, blah, blah, blah. So how do you, and I want to ask you this question first, since you pretty much led into this already, how do you interpret language, like outsourcing, for instance, invisibilizing people of color in discussions of labor?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And look, and it's a conflicted question because that's also the advice that you get if you're a middle class Black woman, that part of what it means to be a Black woman making it to the middle class is that you're able to outsource particular kinds of labor. And when we say outsource, it essentially means that you get to do an Uber-based version of hiring a maid and a butler, right? That you hire somebody to clean your house, somebody to run your errands, somebody to do your grocery shopping in a different kind of economic configuration. The upper classes had live-in folks to do those things. Now, you don't have to have that level of economics, but you are essentially hiring somebody to do those jobs, right? And prior to having maids and butlers, what white folks had was enslaved folks who did that kind of work, right? And indentured servants. The challenge is that in making that a conversation solely about interpersonal exploitation, which I do think is an important conversation, we're missing the ways that our structures of working entirely are unsustainable, right? We are missing the ways that we have sort of created a world where we don't pay folks fair wages. We expect people to be on all the time, where people cannot afford housing, and they certainly can't afford to live sometimes in close proximity to their own families, and then also have access to the kind of economic structure, like, so the job, so either you live next to your family or you have a good job. Sometimes you can't do both. And so to me, that becomes an invitation. If white women would get on board, right, that becomes an invitation for kind of feminist solidarity around the need to dismantle capitalism, or to have a real reckoning with the way that, so, it's like when I give talks and I'll say to folks, like, isn't everybody in this room exhausted? Because all of us are doing far more labor than we should be doing. Now, certainly we know that working class women of color are the most exploited in that system, but the solidarity comes when we recognize that everybody is exhausted and burnt out, and that we have created that as a structural condition that then allows middle class folks to sort of displace that onto working class folks, right? And no one ever looks to the top and says, why don't you create more sustainable working structures for us all that are not rooted in our need to have other people to do the kinds of sustaining labor that we need for our lives to work. And so for me, as somebody who is always conflicted about what it means to outsource and also very much in need of support structures, I want to have a structural conversation, not to let white women off the hook, but as a way to sort of help us to but the thing that I don't want to have happen in this conversation, in any conversation around multiracial solidarity and feminism, is one where Black women are sort of styled as the people who are always having to check white women and say, you are all endlessly exploiting us, right? Because then we just sound reactionary when there's actually a structural problem to be handled. And it's about the way capitalism creates unsustainable structures of working for all of us. And then hides the folks the elites who sort of pull the strings and put us in competition for resources and time.
I have had a very similar reaction on book tour in terms of, I feel like I'm often put in a position in which, you know, the feminisms that I am citing and the thinkers are reactionary, which I think, you know, further misinterprets those movements, but also, you know, casts white feminism as the default feminism, which I think is abundantly untrue if you know, actually review historical archives. Roxane, I want to put the same question to you in terms of how you interpret, you know, language like quote unquote outsourcing, invisibilizing labor from people of color, or any similar, you know, language that you've encountered.
I think that we have this idea, and it largely comes from white feminism and girl boss feminism, that if we just outsource everything, we can succeed. But what success is in that metric is having what white men have.
Right.
And so just like we need to rethink capitalism and really challenge capitalism, as Brittany suggested, and she's absolutely right, we have to also figure out what our goals are as feminists so that we can move away from the idea that if we just outsource the things that we don't want to do, we'll be okay and we'll reach the promised land. Because what we're saying is that as long as we reach the promised land, it does not matter who we leave behind. And again, this has been the historical problem with mainstream feminism. It's that we're going to advance the cause of women while leaving people behind. And we'll get to you later. We will come back and find you. And we never do. And by we, I mean they. And it just, there's a reason why womanism exists, and why there are so many feminists of color who don't try to do more within mainstream feminism, because they know it's going to fall on deaf ears. And a lot of us, especially if you're middle class or even better, it's uncomfortable to think about the changes we would have to make a lot of this liberation possible. But it is going to require all of us getting a little more uncomfortable and challenging the very things that have probably contributed to our success. And I hope that we're getting ready for that conversation, because I think it needs to be had. And the pandemic has really shown the yawning gap within all communities, but I think in particular the feminist community, because there are some feminists and women who are doing just fine because they work from home and they don't have to show up at the grocery store or the dry cleaner every day and stand for 8 hours and interact with the public, and they're still making money, and nothing has really changed. And there are women who, for whom everything has changed, whether it is that they've had COVID, or they've had to take care of family members with COVID, or they've lost people, or they're working in really unsafe conditions. And, we have to deal with that.
Barbara, how do you interpret, words like outsourcing, especially, given your canon of work and the conversations that you have fostered specifically within Black feminism?
When you first raised the term outsourcing, I thought of, sending US businesses, corporations, factories to other nations where labor is cheaper, where working conditions are worse, where there are no standards for protecting workers, and really gutting economies both here and there. Here by getting rid of jobs that could support a working class family, and also intimidating people from union organizing here. If you don't, toe the line, if you end up unionizing, we're going to send this factory somewhere else. And then, of course, exploiting workers in other nations. So I've never really heard the term outsourcing used to mean hiring somebody to help you do the stuff, the domestic, work that all of us need to do. So that's what I first thought of. I think one of the things I really want to make sure to share during this conversation, and this is a place that could begin, is to talk about solidarity Because if you're concerned about the kind of outsourcing that I just mentioned and how women in other nations, the global south, the third world, whatever term we use, if we're concerned about that, then we make different choices here. And also then internally here within the United States, I think there's a solidarity. We've talked about our situation as Black women, but there are other women of color who also are experiencing other kinds of exploitation or similar kinds of exploitation, particularly as workers and economically. So as I said, I'm always beating the drum for that consciousness around solidarity.
I wanted to also be sure and ask all of you this question. It's very pertinent to the dynamics that have already come up. In my own analysis of white feminism as an ideology and as a practice, all of the things that we have already raised, exploitation of labor or any sort of critique of economics, to my research and my assessment and many of the thinkers I cite, white feminism does not go anywhere near economics. It is not factored into the approach, much like how Roxane said. And you can see that, on an individual level in terms of like the highly individualized narratives of white feminism that, constitute quote unquote feminist coverage in this country. But, even in terms of like platforms, that I studied and cited in terms of, upper to middle to upper class white suffragists in this country, like they didn't necessarily think about economics either. This is not a coincidence, as far as the exploitation of labor that, many of the speakers have just said. In Women, Race, and Class, Angela Davis writes, very concisely and very beautifully that not so much when it comes to white feminism specifically, but for white women, she argues that this is somewhat intentional in that, much like Brittany was saying at the top of the discussion, introducing those types of dynamics would create, a very complex relationship to their maids and therefore their own empowerment. So one of the things I wanted to pose was like, why else, given that we've cleared that already, why else do you think that, white feminism or, Roxane said earlier, like girl boss feminism, mainstream feminism, corporate feminism. I group a lot of these together in my book very intentionally because I think that what binds them is this very like aspiration to whiteness that all women should have. But, given all the different lanes and how you're coming to this, why do you all think that, white feminism doesn't go anywhere near economics as an ideology and practice? And I'm going to leave that to whoever would like to answer first.
Well, I'll take it.
I'd like to say, if it went near it, it would blow the whole deal up. That's what would happen. You can't have, well, we used to call it bourgeois feminism, and I think that's actually better than white feminism because it's not prioritizing someone's racial / ethnic identity. It's bourgeois feminism is talking about a set of values. Being white doesn't necessarily define your values, although there's too much of a overlapping Venn diagram between being white in the United States and being racist and problematic. So not that naive, but it's not, an absolute like sentence of no return to be born white in the United States. There's a history, and you and I talked about this, Koa, when we first began having conversations. There's a history of anti-racist feminism in the United States that virtually no one knows exist. But to get back to your original question, if bourgeois / white feminism, girl boss feminism, etc., dealt with class and economic exploitation, it'd blow the whole deal up. So better not to mind that and just, have your little nice Scarlett O'Hara life.
Roxane, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was simply going to say that that kind of feminism benefits from capitalism. And so why would they compromise it? It's the same reason that 54% or give 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and a similar number of white women voted for him in 2020, because his white supremacy and his misogyny benefited them. Or they didn't want to rock that boat because they understand that they may not have absolute power, but they certainly have more power than the women that they choose to leave behind and trample on. And why would they compromise that? Why would they give up their comfort for the benefit of the greater good? They just don't care. And, you know, that's certainly one way to live, but I think that Black women, you know, women of color, frankly, are intimately aware with this kind of feminism. And as Barbara suggests, bourgeois feminism is a really good way of describing this kind of feminism, because it's not only white women that are engaging in this brand of feminism where they're unwilling to critique capitalism, but I will say it's predominantly white women.
Yeah, I was going to add that, you know, I have summed this up by saying, you know, white women's feminisms have very much in the aggregate been about the pursuit of equality. And I understand Black feminism to be a project that's about justice. And those things are different. And so white women have often seen their highest freedom aspiration as being equality with white men, the kind of economic power, the kind of political power, the ability to, you know, to run the world as a colonial power in the way that white men do. And the thing that white women feel robbed of is the sort of power sharing arrangements that the old boys networks have. Justice is about a kind, you know, it's about a kind of equity, a fair distribution of resources, one in which everyone gets the things that they need to live and thrive. And I think that it's hard for us because we, you know, we vaunt equality, and certainly I believe in equality, but we don't understand that equality in a white project is really about white folks jockeying for power and position among each other. And it's not actually about all of the folks that they subjugate in order to corral all those resources for themselves. And quite frankly, one of the reasons that, you know, that I am a Black feminist is because it's not just white women who think in that way. That's also a limitation that Black men often have, even when they're committed to the work of equality or justice, is that they see what white men have and how white men run the world as the highest freedom aspiration, that what they want is that kind of power. And one of the things that I think then has to happen when we reimagine or dismantle the project of white feminism is by recognizing like that it's the sort of errant justice project or errant feminist project in the making. There are other women creating feminisms at the time that white women sort of show up and say, give us our rights so that we can be colonizers like our dudes, right? Like white women don't invent this, but like colonizers, they certainly sort of feel some kind of ownership over the project. And so for me, part of the challenge of thinking about what white feminism means is that I mostly don't really want to talk about it, to be honest with you, because it feels like the least imaginative project among all of the feminist projects that we have. And I also want to take Barbara's point, right, which is that one of the ways we also need to complicate what specifically we mean by white feminism is like some of the most radical and interesting feminists are those like 1970s second wave feminists. Now they have other problems, right? They're sort of anti-sex, anti-porn, and sometimes,
Anti-trans.
I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say trans exclusionary, right? But that assumes that, but that's also the Twitter version of feminist history. That's not a sort of rigorous so I learned about a critique of class by reading Heidi Hartman talking about the unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism, right? There is a radical class analysis that comes out of certain segments of white women's feminism and theorizing that becomes really important. And so I just want us to have a more complex conversation about this. And here is why I'm so invested in that. It isn't because I want to it ain't because I want to resuscitate white women's shenanigans. I mean, I think anybody who knows me or has read me knows I'm not here for it at all. But what I said before is the thing that I stand on, which is that people are very comfortable with Black women sort of coming in and being like, here's all the problems with white women, right? Here's all the ways that they trash. Here's all the ways. And I'm like, look, we can have that conversation all day long. But quite frankly, some of the best class analysis that exists in feminist thinking does come from those sort of radical socialist, lesbian, white ladies in the 1960s and 70s. And I think that we can hold both things to be true, that they aren't engaged in the same kind of feminist project as Roxane put it, the girl boss feminists who just want to be sort of like capitalist with gender parity, right? Those two things are really different kinds of things. And I think we got to have a more robust understanding of tradition so that, because here's the last point, because when white folks are trying to figure out what are the legacies by which they cannot be problematic white people, we have to point to legacy. We don't just say to them, oh, you just be like these Black feminists. We can also say there are legacies of radical white racial politics, anti-racism, different kinds of feminism that you can be in and a part of that are also part of your ancestry and legacy. And I think, to me, that's a more rigorous, less reactionary approach to this. So.
I want to address a point that Barbara raised earlier, which was actually in my notes to discuss that anyway. But when I was researching my book, I happened upon some consistent data that supported that, you know, in the last 5-ish years or so, a little more, depending on what part of the country you're talking about, support for unions have really grown in this country. And as far as I can, you know, see, and then with other research I've done, this is the first time we're seeing a growing support in this capacity post-Reagan. So to me, that's kind of huge. What are some ways in which you respectively each think that this support for unions that is growing in this country can be translated into protections specifically for workers of color? And I'll leave that to whoever would like to answer first.
I'll just quickly say, oh, go ahead, Ms. Barbara.
I'll just say, I think unions are great, and I wish that more people would get on board, because the thing that unions do that I wish every sort of organizing group did is like everyone gets taken care of. Now, of course, the same issues that we deal with in the real world are prevalent in unions. I'm in 2 unions, the WGA and the Screen Actors Guild. And, you know, at least, you know, at the end of the day, you have some basic needs met. You have health insurance and you have job protections to make sure that you're not necessarily going to be exploited on the job. And these kinds of things benefit women and people of color, queer people, trans people, far more, because we're the ones who generally need these kinds of protections in the first place. And so I think that the more that workplaces unionize, the more that people of color and Black people especially are going to be able to thrive, because we will know that some of the bullshit that we deal with in the workplace will be addressed by workplace protections, and that we will have an entire workforce standing alongside us simply because we're all members of the union. Whether they like us, don't like us, feel some kind of way about us, it doesn't matter, because we're just in this union. And I don't say that to idealize unions, but that's simply how they work. And when a union works, and it doesn't always, but when a union works, it makes a lot of things possible. It evens the playing field in a way that other forms of organizing simply don't.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, you had your square unmuted. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to, this may not exactly address the question as you framed it, but I'd wanted to share that there are Black women leading a unionizing effort in Alabama, Bessemer, Alabama, where there's an Amazon fulfillment center. And here we see then leadership of tough unionizing effort with Black women visible, at the forefront. When we think about teachers' strikes and teachers organizing that has happened in recent years, depending on what kind of city, if it's a city like Chicago, a lot of that involvement and participation is they are teachers of color. If you look at nurses, if you look at people working in meat packing and poultry processing factories, not that necessarily all of them are unionizing, but there are lots of sectors where unionizing could happen, is happening, should happen. And when and if that does, women of color then are at the forefront and definitely lead it and also define and benefit from it.
I'll just briefly add, I too am part of a union. I work at my university is unionized, so I am part of the AAUP for professors, full paying member, and believe in it wholeheartedly. And also having lived, having worked and lived in Alabama, I too have been following the kind of unionization of these Amazon workers and really cheering for them because, I think that one of our huge challenges is that we have sort of come back to a world where we have these sort of huge corporate monopolies and not the political will to break up big corporations, big tech. And so when you live in a situation where the most effective inroads against a white supremacist madman is big tech companies individually deciding to regulate him, then you are, in a situation where the challenge of that is that they do a social good and then use that social good to mask the ways in which they exploit their workers, particularly somebody like Amazon, right? So yes, they kick Parler off, but also they make Black folks miserable. I've had relatives who've needed settlements from Amazon because of poor working conditions. Like, it's a very personal thing. And at the same time, one of the challenges that we then have is, but they have also become the market. Like, they don't just control the market, they are the marketplace. And so they create a set of conditions where you're forced to participate out of necessity, other than sort of minor interventions like don't buy your books from Amazon, don't buy Koa's book from Amazon, right? But still. And so, proud member of a union, and also want to echo what Barbara said around Black women organizing. One of my colleagues at Rutgers, Dr. Cherie Davis Faulkner, works with the Black Worker Center, runs a program that helps to train and bring women of color into union organizing. It's called Will and Power, and it's housed at Rutgers, where we have we have a school of labor studies and all of that. So it's part of the work that gets done at the place that I work. And so there is a push right now, and we need to support that work in every way that we can.
I wanted to quickly add before going to my next question that it was very revealing to me in doing the research for my book, in studying so much union activism in this country, and how, for all the conversations I've had to report on and spaces I've passed through, where there's a very white feminist ideology and practice of, the wage gap or, any sort of pay discrepancy. Union politics has never been a part of white feminism. And what's so fascinating when you delve into that history in this country is that it is an incredible trove of women's rights activism, and across race, in some ways across class, immigrant working class women. It is a really incredible part of women's history in this country that white feminism does not go anywhere near in terms of ideology, but I would also argue just even in terms of who they work with and who, that practice tries to build coalitions with. The women who, built unions and, were industrial feminists, they were not being invited to the suffrage marches. So I think that's very telling.
I was about to say, yeah, those Lowell mill ladies, who were being exploited and told in the 1830s, you can't have sex, you have to go to church, you have a curfew in order to keep this job working in a mill, right? Ultimately storm that mill. And they are part of the inspiration for much of the organizing that happens in the 1840s. But because they don't meet a kind of white respectability narrative about what femininity means, then they are excluded. And that also makes me think that one of the final things that I would say about how I think the project of white feminism becomes problematic is it also undergirds this really limiting idea of what femininity is. And one of the things I'm always saying to my white women students in my bid to sort of get them to like think about how to be in solidarity is like that narrative of femininity limits your life chances and capacities too, right? So it's not just it's about labor, it's about all of it, but it's also about like white femininity is flimsy, it's high fem, it's super, like this is the white feminist narrative about femininity as a thing that needs to be protected. It gets weaponized, and you know what I mean, all of that sort of stuff. Those are those sort of places where I want to box white feminist, right? When they don't have a critique about like the politics of white femininity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And all of those things are protected by commercialism, marketing, all those sorts of things. My last question before we go to questions from the audience, and I encourage you, if you have questions, this would be the space to make sure they get in there so that I can review them and present them to our illustrious speakers. I'm interested to discuss all of this with you because, you've all promoted books and published books on theory and your own experiences. I have found on Book Tour for White Feminism a very earnest question that I keep getting. I'm paraphrasing it, but this is essentially what I keep getting asked is how do I, coming off of reading this book, how do I, as the person who's asking me this question, how do I keep my home running the same way? How do I keep my business running in the exact same capacity? How do I keep all my managerial practices? How do I keep all my middle class ambitions? And quote unquote, be inclusive to women of color. And I keep trying to say in diplomatic terms, but also, depending on my audience, I keep trying to tell them that that is not possible. That the structure, much like Brittany said at the top of this talk, that they are engaging in, that manages people a certain way, that exploits, freelancer part-time workers, that basically furnishes this very underpaid domestic labor. That structure is made possible by just sort of quote unquote being inclusive to women of color. It doesn't necessarily centralize any of these ideas or practices that feminisms that are non-white in their ideology have been talking about for a very long time, and that those are actually incompatible. I'm interested to ask all of you, given the conversation that we've had, what are some alternative structures or even just legislative efforts that you advocate in approaching this structural problem? And I think, Roxane, I'll go to you first.
I think this is an uphill battle. How do you get people to make themselves uncomfortable enough to benefit the greater good? And I don't know. We don't have these answers, but I do think that we need to rethink what we consider value, and we have to rethink what we consider productivity. We have to have a serious conversation about subsidized childcare. The reality is that not all of us have children, but the majority of working women are also parents, and the majority of the domestic responsibilities fall on their shoulders. And we have seen disproportionately, again, in the pandemic, that women have borne the brunt of this, that they have left the workplace, they have lost their jobs, they have been expected to take up the slack at home, while their male partners continue to just be male partners. And of course, there's always going to be some exception. Yes, I know, like there's this one woman, oh, that's not my husband. Well, girl, you hold on to him. That's fine. It's just so frustrating.
Your husband is not a structural solution.
Yeah, like it's just like we need more than you're like one little dude. And so we have to have a conversation about subsidized childcare and health. We have to start really thinking, how do we make these policies that we think are pipe dreams realities, not only childcare, but healthcare? How do we end this nonsense discussion about reproductive freedom once and for all? And that one is a big one, but like, we have to start talking about the issues that actually affect women. And then we have to figure out how we say no to some of the material comforts that we have become very accustomed to. And it just requires saying, I'm willing to give this up because I understand that it's going to benefit more than just me. And it's going to be hard. I mean, frankly, I don't know how I'm going to do it. There are some things that I have become very accustomed to that are very nice. But you know what? I also have my eyes on the prize. And it's, how can you enjoy something when you know that you're one of a few enjoying that thing, and at whose expense? And I think we also have to reframe the conversation so we understand it's not about sacrifice, it's about creating equity. And to create equity, it has to come from somewhere.
Thank you. Barbara, I'm really curious to put this question to you about alternative structures, because you laid out in one of your pieces last year basically an entire, what I would argue, structural plan for eliminating white supremacy, which you pulled off in like 800 words.
Yes, I did. And you were referring to my Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker plan on the scale of a Marshall Plan to do something that no one has ever claimed that they thought it was possible to do, which is to eradicate white supremacy. And it was kind of a thought experiment, because it's not that, just because you write about it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. But if white supremacy has a beginning, and we're definitely in the middle of it still, could it possibly have an end? What might we do? So there's that. But I wanted to address this issue around, can you keep everything you have and do everything the same way that you have been doing it and still be supportive to women of color? And you're right. The answer is no. The problem that we have here is that the oppressions, the systemic oppressions that define our society and our political economy, they have ideologies and they have value systems. And it's really, really difficult to kind of step out on your own. Like, is it possible for you to be, quote, successful, end quote, and only get a new car every 3 years as opposed to every other year? Is it possible for your kids not to go to the ritzy private summer camp, but to try, say, a Girl Scout camp, or some other kind of camping or summer activity? I mean, when you're empty inside, this is what I feel. Been thinking about the answer to the question. When you're empty inside, you need things to fill it. And because our society doesn't really give us many things that are about filling that emptiness, like culture, real culture, and love, and passion, and ingenuity, all the things that make life worth living, we don't get that. What we get is like the empty stuff. So we keep trying to fill it, with Prada bags and whatever those things are. I don't even know what they are. That's how far away I am from the brands, from the current brands. But I don't know what they are. But be that as it may, you're trying to fill something inside of you. And then it's hard to think about that other person who doesn't necessarily have running water or safe water, even though they live in a metropolitan area. So it's a big, long project.
Brittany, I'm going to give you,
and worth it.
Brittany, I'm going to give you the last word in terms of structural changes or legislation that you advocate in tweaking this locked hierarchy that we're all in. And in some cases, I would argue not tweaking, eradicating.
That's right. No, I just really appreciate Barbara's point about the the spiritual bankruptcy that is produced by these systems, right? And I think that that's part of the thing that we've got to begin to tap into when we talk to people is you have all this stuff, but are you happy, right? That if life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is what this project is about, I've been thinking a lot about the way that the word is not that you get happiness at the end, but you get to just pursue it. And that's the thing that what capitalism and white feminism and wrong understandings of systems lock us into is an endless pursuit that doesn't actually ever lead us anywhere, but to this pursuit of more and more and the feeling like we never have enough. So I think that spiritual conversation has to matter, and I don't think it has to be religious. I think that people feel like part of the reason the pandemic has been so hard for so many folks is because many of us have had to be confronted with how our endless sort of going after and laboring for capitalism, what are the things that you come home to and you don't have because you spent all of this time going out to work to get things. So I think that's a really important point. I also think that for me, the thing I care a lot about on the way to the revolution that we need is a robust investment in the idea of a public good, right? So that is deregulation of corporations. That is massive reinvestment in public schools. That is making college affordable, right? And the thing that I maintain is that part of the reason that conversation matters for feminism is because the way that the right has eroded our investment in the public good is by associating it with Black women and welfare queens, right? And Latinx women being undeserving, poor immigrants come to drop their anchor babies and take, resources from taxpayers, right? So women's lives, particularly the lives of women of color, have been marshaled in a narrative to erode our investment in a government that more equitably invests in the public. And so it has to be a feminist project to say that taking away that part of the way you dismantle the narrative that white feminism tells about its own virtue is by arguing that all of us need to be at the public swimming pool together and all our kids need to be in these public schools together and we should pay teachers really well, right? And give them, you know what I mean? Like this actually, some of this, that doesn't get you a dismantling of capitalism. It doesn't get you like an end to racism, but it does get you the kinds of communal relations that help you to imagine that maybe we could live differently in relationship to each other. And I do think that's worth pursuing on the way to the revolution.
I agree. And per your point, I just wanted to add that a really successful narrative that I tracked that came like post Reagan in the United States was that, things that are public, whether we're talking about like a library or a museum or, a cultural center are somehow like not good or like
because
bad.
they're racialized. Oh yeah, because they're racialized.
Yeah, and it's been a very successful enduring narrative, but also I feel like because of, not even I feel like, it's cited, white feminism as a practice, the way that it has in those same narratives sought to privatize a lot of things specifically for women's advancement, that goes hand in hand. Thank you all to the panelists for having this discussion with me. This was wonderful. I'm going to go to our questions because we have so many and they seem very good. I'm going to start with, if you did not put anonymous, I will be saying your name out of respect for you. Natasha Sharp asks, what are some signs of hope you have seen that suggest a possibility of us collectively moving toward an inclusive feminism? Whoever would like to answer that.
Well, this is not about an inclusive feminism. It's a model of how a society can change directions, at least slightly. And that's embodied by what happened after George Floyd was lynched in May of last year, accompanied by other lynchings, other extrajudicial murders. And the way that the entire nation, plus the colonies and the territories and also other countries, the way that they stopped whatever it was they had been thinking about before that And they said, you know what? I think those people are right. Black lives do matter. Now, of course, a lot of people who are out there were also Black and people of color. But one of the things that was phenomenal about that period that is described as the largest social movement that ever occurred in the United States by numbers, if it's only about numbers, one of the things that occurred that was really exciting is that there were people in little towns where there was nary a Black or other person of color standing out, protesting with signs and speaking out about Black Lives Mattering. And that's a break point, I think. And it's a model that we can take heart from as we continue to do our feminist work.
Would anyone else like to address that, or shall I move on? I would like to add to that what has made me hopeful in terms of coalition building across women and other marginalized genders is the history of this country, and especially the history that white feminism as an ideology and a practice does not pull from and does not consider as foundational to thinking about gender equality. There's so much rich history of women working across class, across race, across orientation, across gender identity for really shared goals. So a lot of times people have asked me, is an inclusive feminism possible? And I say, it's happened already. It just hasn't happened under white feminism. Let's see. Tawny Lara asks, where can we read more about the anti-racist feminism Barbara is speaking of? Barbara, I'm going to let you answer that because I learned about that from you.
Oh, okay. Here we get to the bibliography section of our discussion. I think you should read the book. I think you should read the books by my sister panelists. That would be one thing to do and to start with. If you want to do the oldies but goodies, I would suggest you look at Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology, and that you also look at All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women Studies, which was the first book published about Black women studies in the United States. I am the editor or co-editor of both of those books. There's just a lot that you can find. There's a lot for you to find. So put in your search engine, anti-racist feminism, the feminism of women of color. You should read and find This Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color. That's another oldie but goodie. But there's a rich history that all three, and now Koa with her book, all of us have contributed to, of what does an inclusive women's movement look like.
And I want to add, if you are interested in many of those books that Barbara just cited, I took over the Brooklyn Center Instagram yesterday, where I posted many pictures of the books that I cite in white feminism and that have shaped my thinking about gender. Homegirls is on there right now, as is This Bridge Called My Back, I believe, is in Stories. So those are there if you would like to see them. I highly recommend them. We are running out of time, so I think I'm only going to have time for a couple more, which is too bad because there's a lot of really good questions here. I'm personally really interested in this. Rebecca Amadi asks, what do you have to say about the co-option of intersectionality within white liberal feminism?
It's a thing I write a lot about and that irritates me deeply. But look, very simply put, part of what the co-optation of intersectionality has meant is that it's a way for people to talk about identity politics, and not in the way that the Combahee River Collective meant it when Barbara and her comrades were writing about this in the 1970s, right? So it becomes a way to say, oh, you know, I'm diverse. I've got all of these different experiences, and this helps me to have a fuller picture to understand myself. And that's a misunderstanding of what intersectionality is about. It is not an account of identity. It is not a thing that is meant to make you more interesting and more diverse among a group of people. It is an account of power. And so it's the difference between saying race and class and gender and saying racism, sexism, and classism, right? And it is asking us to think about how systems of power intersect and interact to make life harder for people who don't have privileges in those systems of power. And what that then means pragmatically is that if you are committed to a politics of an intersectional analysis, is that you are using your feminism to look at places to identify the operations of power and to cede power in the places where you have it. And that's the only way you can really be a committed intersectional feminist.
Anyone else like to add anything to that? No? Okay. We are over time. Many, people wrote so many amazing questions. I wish we could answer them all and then, take a dinner break and then, come back and answer some more. Thank you, my panelists. Thank you so much for prioritizing this conversation and being here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to BPL and the Brooklyn Center, as well as Ms. Foundation. Thank you so much to the team who set this up so we could be together. And stay safe out there, as safe as you can be. Bye.